this Stevens, and the two poems that I asked you to read this week, which were Anecdote of the Jar and Disillusionment of 10 o'clock. And so Wallace Stevens was kind of a really interesting guy. So he was from Hartford, Connecticut, and he was a insurance agent. Like he literally sold insurance, like for in there in Hartford for the majority of his life. And then yet on the side he managed to, I mean, he loved the structure of like a nine working hours, the 9 to 5 job or whatever his working hours were. I don't even know. But he needed that structure because when he didn't have structure, he drank something chronic. So he wrote poetry on the side, and it's so crazy because he ended up becoming like one of the most well known and well respected writers, modernist writers of the 20th century. And so that's unreal to me that he, this was just, his side hobby. He loved to write and very masterful. And so he great use of language, of imagery. He was especially concerned with the human mind and the interaction of the mind with reality and the distortion of reality. And so I think that that's something very interesting and especially something here in Anecdote of the Jar. So I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall, and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. So written in 1919, it was published in Harmonium, which was his first book in 1923. It's three stanzas. Each one contains a quatrain, that four line, no set rhyme scheme. There's some occasional end rhymes there in the poem. There is a repetition of the ound sound in the first two stanzas. We have round, surround, around, round, and ground, which is kind of interesting to note. It's kind of like a circular, causes us to feel a little bit dizzy, like things are swirling about around and around and around. And so it kind of gives us a little bit of a distortion. And I think that's exactly what he was going for. So a jar is a very common like household object. People can use jars for all kinds of things, storing things, canning food. We use it to contain things. We use it to seal things in, keep them fresh, keep them in the fridge. Jars are it's an interesting object, but again, a common object. Um, and so it's interesting to note that it was placed by this unknown speaker, this I, in on a hill in Tennessee. And so the word placed is interesting because he didn't drop it, he didn't leave it behind, he didn't discard it like trash. He placed it there purposefully. It's consciously done. And so that kind of leaves a lot uncertain for the reader because, you know, is it some type of scientific experiment? Like, is the jar full or empty? Is it upside down or is it open to the sky? Does it have a lid on it? So that uncertainty kind of lends itself to, I think, what he was trying to his purpose here, what he was trying to go for. So he places this jar upon the seal, and the jar now made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. So we're moving into some kind of weird process, mysterious process. So, and the jar seems to be the catalyst for it. So he places this jar, and then things begin moving around it and moving up to it. Okay. It's also interesting to note that he chose the word slovenly wilderness. Wilderness we usually say untamed, untouched, unworked. Not slovenly. Slovenly denotes dirty or untidy or disheveled or lazy. And so, slovenly and wilderness don't quite mesh. So that's an interesting choice there. But when he places the jar it causes things to happen. It's a catalyst for action. So in the second stanza, the wilderness begins to rise up and around the jar. So the wilderness begins to rise up and surround the jar and sprawl all around it. And it loses its wildness in the process. It's no longer wild, it's now tame. And so this jar um, has caused this process to start. It starts making everything circle around, then the wilderness starts rising up and sprawling all around the jar, but it loses its wildness in the process. So, um, it also changes, the jar changes. So it's round upon the ground, and now it's tall. It's growing in stature, and now it's also a port meaning an opening or a gate in the air that things can pass in and out. This jar has gone from being just a small object, a man-made object on the hill. Now it's growing in stature and it's becoming a port in the air that things can pass in and out. So things have gotten a little bit more mysterious, maybe a little more supernatural. It's a port, it's a portal to something. And so in the third stanza, the jar takes over, right? It takes dominion. It's interesting that the word dominion is used. A king has dominion over an area. But the jar has altered now. It was regular, then it became round, then it became tall, then it became a port in the air, and now it's gray and bare. And, um, it's the bird and the birds and the wildlife and the natural life are no longer connected to it anymore in that little tiny area. And it's like nothing else in Tennessee where there is wildness and wildlife and all kinds of stuff. So it's very interesting. He seems to be exploring the relationship between humanity and nature, in particular, humankind's desire to kind of impose order and structure on the environment as things grow and change. The industrialization, the industrial revolution, growing and spreading out and expanding out into the natural world and kind of taking over and pushing and forcing our mark on it. And so, mankind has a desire to kind of impose order and structure on things that are wild and in order to tame them. And so, placing an object that's designed to contain things in the middle of the wildness, the wilderness, creates some kind of contrast. You have a man made jar that's used to categorize, to contain, to control, versus this untamed world around it. The jar is, obviously out of place, and we don't really know the purpose of its placement. And it really just kind of depends on the reader's interpretation of the symbolism of the jar itself. Is it some kind of commentary on, the rigid nature of modern life, which is aimed to control and conquer? Or is it modern life that stifles creativity and spontaneity and taming the wildness? It's all really up to the reader to determine what he or she um, kind of places, the meaning that they place on the jar itself. Okay, so let's take a look at the last poem, which is Disillusionment of 10 o'clock. And it was also published in Harmonium in 1915. It was created in 1915 and it appeared in his first book of poetry. Also free verse. Um, the houses are haunted by white night gowns. None are green, or purple with green rings, or green with yellow rings, or yellow with blue rings. None of them are strange, with socks of lace and beaded cinctures. People are not going to dream of baboons and periwinkles. Only here and there an old sailor, drunk and asleep in his boots, catches tigers in red weather. You're like, what the world? This is craziness. But breaking it down, you'll see that there's so much being more packed into this strange disillusionment. Which it's interesting to know that disillusionment is um, a big characteristic of modernist literature. Feeling fragmented, feeling disillusioned, and feeling out of place And so that's interesting that that was there in his title. So it starts with a metaphor of white nightgowns haunting houses. Obviously, the gowns themselves are not haunting houses. He's referring to people, and he's not talking about just any people. He's talking about ordinary, bland, boring people that wear white nightgowns to bed. Not green ones, not purple with green rings, or green with yellow rings, or yellow with blue rings, but white nightgowns that are haunting the houses of America, right? So, obviously, there's something much larger at work here than wishing people wore brightly colored pajamas instead of white ones. He's talking about people, there's nothing creative or exciting about these people whatsoever. He seems to be passing kind of negative judgment on their lack of creativity. He wishes that color and diversity would appear more often, given the fact that he repeats the word rings 3 times there. And he's not talking about just what they're wearing to sleep in. He's talking about how they think, what they care about, how they act. He's really disappointed that they live such boring lives, and he kind of feels like they're not living up to their potential. In lines 7 through 11, he's seeking a strangeness, and when you see that, none of them are strange. I want you to think uniqueness, not a bunch of weirdos. He doesn't want strangers, like strange people. He wants uniqueness. They don't accessorize. They don't wear socks of lace and beaded cinctures, which are belts. And these boring people who are living these boring, dull, bland lives, haunting their houses in white nightgowns, they're not going to dream of baboons and periwinkles. Um, they're not going to be dreaming about monkeys and flowers. That's a little weird, obviously, but that's probably why this is called disillusionment at 10 o'clock. It just adds kind of to the strangeness, the out of placeness. These people are not imaginative when they're awake. So they're not going to be imaginative when they dream. They're going to have bland, boring dreams. These are bland, boring people. Here and there, however, perhaps in town, somewhere out of the suburbs, um, there are imaginative people, old sailors who are kind of not quite the pillars of society. They are, or maybe not what society dreams proper since they drink too much and they sleep in their boots. But they break the cycle, right? They catch tigers in red weather in their dreams because their lives are more exciting than the ghosts that are living in our these houses.